All right. So this morning, Monday, April 7th, you guys are going to use this podcast to familiarize yourself with Chapter 14. It's the beginning of our unit that we focus on social reform, so trying to solve a lot of the problems that were facing America at the time. General time frames about 1820 to right up to the Civil War, 1860. So it's about a 40-year block of time that we'll study. For this question right here, you're going to turn to the back part of your chapter packet to find question number 70. It says define the following. Suffrage, abolition, and temperance. These are three of the bigger movements that we'll be studying in this chapter. The first one, suffrage, is the right to vote. In this chapter, we'll look at the women's struggle for the right to vote. It's not actually until way after what we study that women get that right to vote, but there's another group with freed slaves towards the end of the year after the Civil War where they'll also get the right to vote through the 13th Amendment. Not 13th, 15th. Number two is abolition. This is the movement to stop slavery. So in this era of reform, you have many people in the North in the northern portion of the United States that really want to end slavery. We'll see that movement. And last one is temperance. That's abstaining or not consuming alcohol. Actually see a pretty big problem with alcohol consumption in the larger cities. Husbands would go to work in the factories all day, and before returning home they would go to local saloon or bar, get drunk, and more times there were a lot of issues where they would come home and would be abusive either to their wife or their children. So there was a huge movement to stop the use and consumption of alcohol, which happens in I believe the 18th. Yep, the 18th Amendment, which actually bans the production, the sale, and the transportation of alcohol. All right. Now, if you turn to the first page of your notes, this will seem like it's going quick. This is really just an overview. With you guys reading through 14.1 through 14.4, this will go pretty quick. All right. We've got this week leading up through break. The Monday we come back, we're reviewing and we're quizzing on Tuesday. It's a pretty short and quick chapter. Next couple, three of them will go close together. So you see up here, graphic organizer of inventors. You have Elias Howe, the sewing machine. The impact, dozens of shirts could be made in time that one handmade shirt could be made. Same thing as in the factories. When you have a machine, you'd be able to make it quicker than by hand. You have Cyrus McCormick, the mechanical reaper. One person could do the work of five people with this machine. And you have John Deere, the lightweight steel plow. Horses could tend to the fields in less time. You start to see the emergence of railroads in large number, and yes, they were positive, a lot of positives, but unfortunately there were a couple negatives. The railroads destroyed farmers' fields. Horse-drawn wagon workers lost their jobs, kind of similar to like a blacksmith during the Industrial Revolutions. People with specialized jobs lost their jobs. And people thought they were unreliable and safe. They didn't know what time they were going to show up. There were a lot of derailments, which meant that they fell off the rails. Products that were made in the North. So if you take a look at the map to this side, the one that we have painted up there on the wall, you have products being made in the North would be textiles, iron and steel. You had people mining different materials. You had grain and lumber. And the railroads affected both the North and the South, and factory owners. So what you see here is you have major rail cities, New York City, Chicago, and Cincinnati. So again, remember, they're in the North, pretty much the Northeast. Chicago and Cincinnati going a little bit more Midwest. But it affected factory owners because you could transport large amounts of raw materials and unfinished products much quicker and easier than ever before. For farmers, they were able to get cheap grain from the West. So when you're thinking of like the states that are in purple, and even maybe some of the green states that were established, they could get it from the West to markets in the East very quick. And unfortunately, farming in New England ends. Remember that when we studied the 13 colonies, the soil there really wasn't that great. It was rocky soil, short growing seasons, so it was easier to rely on people in the West and the Great Plains. Similar similar to today. And then in the West, they sent grain to the East for money as well. Flip over to the next page. It says Notes for Section 2. This is a little bit of review from the Industrial Revolution. It fits right into this chapter because along with those issues, you're going to start to see people reforming the unsafe working conditions and the hazards of factory life. So again, they had long days, short pay, extreme temperatures, dangerous machines. An artisan are people who were harder to replace than unskilled workers. So it was you were able to pay artisans a little bit more than unskilled laborers because they had a skill that wasn't easily able to duplicate. So they end up creating trade unions. And trade unions are similar to like a teachers union in that the group is going to fight for the rights of their organization. So in this case, they were people fighting for the rights of people in the factories. Primarily, they were searching for better pay, shorter work days, and better work conditions. At the same time, you have thousands upon hundreds of thousands of people entering the United States through immigration, or they're leaving places probably, they're leaving all different places, but mostly Western Europe. So we see like Ireland and Germany. And even on the other far side, you have Asian countries who will leave, who actually arrive in California, as opposed to the European countries who are going to come through, most likely New York State through Ellis Island. But you have Ireland, who has the potato famine, and when they come here, they work on the canals and the factories, and they help build the railroads. In Germany, there was a major revolution, so there were people came here. They were farmers, merchants, and artisans. When we get to the next chapter, we'll take a look at how all of these groups tried to adapt to American society when they got here. There was a group called the Nativists and the Know Nothing Political Party that made it really difficult for immigrants to come, which is kind of ironic because these nativists were natural-born citizens here in the United States. They thought that immigrants would take their jobs and blame them for the rise in crime. But what kind of is ironic is that these nativists, one generation before, were immigrants themselves. So they make it really difficult for new people coming in since they've settled there, but they forget the fact that they were once immigrants as well. And they'll start the Know Nothing Party, and really their stance was to keep America for the Americas. And really what that means is they're trying to limit the rights and make life harder for those who are new coming into the country, specifically those that don't speak English and would be taking factory jobs away from them. That last question, if you take a look on the bottom of your page 2, it says, describe problems that free Americans, African Americans face in the U.S. They face discrimination and intimidation, and that will lead right into the next chapter as well. Flip that over to the next page. For notes 3, you're still looking. So in the North, remember, you've got the railroads, you've got the factories, the textile mills. And so the North is really bustling with big business, big industry, as opposed to the South. And the South is much, much different. The South is still going to remain mostly agricultural, or they're into farming. So products that were created there, you had iron, cotton, livestock, which would be pigs, oxen, horses, mules, beef cattle, rice, tobacco, sugarcane, and indigo. Pretty much what we've studied in the past. There was some industry in the South. Remember, once steam power comes along, they're able to move the factories away from running rivers and open water in the northeast, and they're able to move some factories to the South. They had some cotton mills, ironworks. Railroads will eventually reach down there, along with machines, tools, cannon, and flour mills. And your first question said, how did the cotton gin affect the cotton industry in the South? You should remember this from earlier, from the Industrial Revolution, that the cotton gin will increase the rate of production for cotton. So it'll increase the need for slavery because you'll need more slaves tending to the field and picking and tending to the cotton gin and planting more cotton. That's where you see the idea that the South was known as the Cotton Kingdom. And number 2, it says, why was the South economically dependent on the North? The South depended on the North and Europe heavily because they borrowed money from northern banks. and bought many European goods that the South didn't produce. Last page, page 4. Um, Page 4 really deals with African Americans. And so you see here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 different social classes in the South. The top, the very highest, is considered the cottonocracy. And these were people who owned 50 or more slaves. And we've talked about this in the past coming from 4th and 5th grade, that I think sometimes you think that everybody in the South had these huge plantations with many, many slaves. And you can see here that was not the case. That's less than 1% of the population. The majority, 75%, were small farmers. They were plain folk. They owned their own land and had 1 to 2 slaves. And they actually worked in the fields with them. So it was a little bit different than, obviously, the cottonocracy. In addition to that, you have poor whites. So they did not own land. They sometimes rented it. They were a social class above freed African Americans and slaves. So you've got the cottonocracy on the top, the bulk of small farmers, then you have poor whites, then you have freed African Americans. And these were descendants. That means that they came from families of freed slaves from the American Revolution. They weren't allowed to vote or travel, and slave owners were fearful that freed slaves would encourage rebellion of slaves, possibly arm them and help them escape. That didn't happen on a large scale. And then lastly, a third of the southern population were enslaved African Americans. And they're, unfortunately, this key word right here, they're actually considered property. Okay, so they're considered property. They're not even considered a human. It says there, let's see, describe family life of enslaved African Americans. The families, unfortunately, were often broke up. So if they came straight from Africa or from possibly a different plantation when they were sold into slavery, you would take a mother and a father and separate them, and you would take the kids away from them. They didn't want them to have any sense of family or belonging, mentally and physically breaking them down, which led to extended families where even if they weren't blood related, when they came to a plantation, the elders would take on the figure of the grandparents, and then you would have people who would be parents' age and then children. It was communal living, so they really tried to take care of each other. And they tried to preserve traditions, storytelling, songs, and religion. Lastly, enslaved Americans made up a third of the population in the South, and there were slave codes that made it really difficult, beyond just not having freedom, but made it difficult for them to have a productive life. They weren't allowed to own guns. They weren't allowed to read or write. They weren't allowed to be in groups of more than, I believe, 3 or more. And they needed written permission to leave the master's land. There were some ways that slaves end up fighting back. Sometimes they break tools, they destroyed crops, and they steal food. This picture right here is of Frederick Douglass, who should sound familiar. Lived here in Rochester and produced a newspaper called the North Star. He was an abolitionist, which meant he was against slavery and wanted to ban and end slavery. And the abolitionists start to rebel through writing and the creation of the Underground Railroad, which we'll take a look at later this week. The Underground Railroad was a network of paths that people would take to get from the south to the north, with houses along the way that would actually hide the slaves. It wasn't an actual tunnel that was from the south to the north. Sometimes it's a misconception that some people have. And then right here you can see on this slave's back, you can see he must have done something at some point that obviously angered a slave master. And the raised skin is from times that he was whipped. And so you can imagine very, very painful. It was disgraceful for them. It was not something that was obviously something to look forward to. Definitely one of the evils of slavery. And let's see, let's turn to page, it's almost your last page, I think it's page 17. You're going to look at the page that Mrs. Salzbach created. Remember, it has the whole chapter on one page from the really, really big ideas. You have the 3 areas of social reform here in green. You have social reform, anti-slavery reform, and women rights movement. The information that's below here, we'll study this, so if it looks unfamiliar, that's totally fine. You've got a group of reformers here. You've got Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Dorothea Dix, Horace Mann, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott. What would be really helpful for you when we get ready for our quiz, I would write down 1, 2, 3, 4. I would write down these 4 people and make sure that you have these notes written down for them. So like Harriet Tubman was known as Moses. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker from Philadelphia and part of the anti-slavery movement. You have Sojourner Truth, who up here was a former slave and fought for abolitionists, so the end of slavery and women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the Seneca Falls Convention and helped write the Declaration of Sentiments, which we'll look at. Sounds familiar like the Declaration of Independence, but it's more based broadly about women's rights. And then Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA. There will be a written portion of this quiz coming up when you guys get back from break, and it will be about women being denied equal rights at that time period. We'll spend a whole day on that. But you'll need to know why women were not treated equal and giving specific details, which will give you plenty to be prepared for that writing. At this point, you should have plenty of time left in the class. You can go through, you can study these notes. It's the bulk of, remember, what your quiz will be on, as well as the other information in here, which gives you plenty of time, I'm hoping, for you guys to start in on 14.1. So you can see from the agenda for this week that you do have 4 assignments, but they'll be chunked enough that you'll have time in class to get them started. All right, guys, have a great day.